Okay, so let's continue. We cut the last video rather short. We only did 5 MCQs in that one. So uh, we'll be starting off with question 6 for this one. So what is one of the long-term benefits? So a long-term benefit to a firm of vertical integration. Now you should know vertical integration is where you try to take control or greater control of the particular supply chain of the firm. So it's the same industry. You're just merging with other firms that are not in the same stage of production. Um, so it could either be forward towards your retail, towards your finished good, or it could be backward towards the source, towards raw materials. Okay. A concentration on activities in which the firm has a comparative advantage. Well, if the firm was specializing and concentrating on the activities in which it has in which it is good at, in which it has a comparative advantage, then why would it be integrating backwards into other stages of production which it is completely new at, right? It would just stick to what it's good at. So not a reduction in the total costs involved in agreeing contracts with other firms. Well, this could be it, because now you basically have more control of the supply chain when you vertically integrate. So let's suppose you went backwards, you took control or you integrated with the raw material suppliers. Now you don't have to sign any contracts with them. You don't have any of those issues, because you simply control them now. You control the supply of raw materials yourself. So that could be it. See an increase in the firm's market share. Well, that is mainly something that you normally see in horizontal integration, where you merge with other firms in the same stage of production in the same industry. With vertical integration, for the particular product that you're making, you still have more or less the same market share, especially in the long run, at the very least. Because what's happened here is you haven't really you're not making more of the product. Understand that you're simply gaining more control. Instead of, let's say, buying raw materials from someone else, you now have control of your own raw materials, or you can now sell the product yourself instead of passing it on to someone else. But you're not making more of the product. That's what you do in horizontal integration. If you're not making more of the product, then it is very difficult to increase your market share, at least in the long run. Improvements in efficiency resulting from increased use of market incentives. No, I don't see how efficiency helps, and I don't see how you're using market incentives here. In fact, when you're going to other stages of production, you're probably going to be inefficient there, because, well, you're just not that good at doing so. You're just new to it at the moment, at least. 7. Organizers of a major sporting event produce official souvenir products. Um, okay, so they're producing official souvenir products, and this is only being done by the organizers. Cheaper unofficial souvenirs are also produced by street traders who sell them to people walking to the event. So now you have street traders, and they're producing cheaper unofficial souvenirs. What is this an example? This seems like an interesting question, in fact. Um, so let's first cross out what it is not an example of. It is not an example of price leadership, because, well, your unofficial sellers aren't following the given price. They're going with their own price, and price leadership normally you see in an oligopoly, which clearly this isn't. Um, it is not a case of price discrimination. Now, this may be a common misconception, because you think, well, the product is the same and you're selling them, different prices for official and different prices for unofficial products. But the idea behind price discrimination is that the product itself has to be literally the same. Here, you can't say the product is the same, because, well, one was produced by the sporting event of organizers. That's your official product, and the unofficial one, if it's cheaper, clearly it's going to be of lower quality. It's like it's more like the difference between buying an original game for your I don't know, for your PS4, or for your Xbox 360, or buying a pirated one, right? You can't call them the same product. They're not the same product. So because they're not the same product, and the same producer isn't even selling them, so because of those two reasons, you can't call this price discrimination. The product itself is just different. Okay, so that then you're left with contestable market or perfect competition. You can cross out perfect competition, because for that you need to have a lot. You didn't have a lot of basically firms selling the same product, which isn't happening here. Another very important metric to judge is that in perfect competition, the firms or producers rather have to be price. I can even write it here. Have to be price takers. That clearly isn't happening here. Now, these guys are just selling at a cheaper price that they want to. These guys were selling at the original price, whatever price they wanted to. So they're not price takers. It is in perfect competition, which leaves you with contestable markets. And understand this may not be a perfectly contestable market, but the contestable market theory can apply anywhere where basically you're making the market more contestable, where there is a producer perhaps. uh, it doesn't matter which particular structure the producer exists in, but now other new entrants can enter. It's being made easier for them to enter because the barriers to entry or exit are reducing. A perfectly contestable market would be where there are zero barriers to entry and enter, or entry or exit. But the contestable market theory can be applied wherever barriers to entry or exit start to reduce, wherever the threat of entry increases. And that is what's happening here, right? Because you had organizers of a major sporting event, and they had a sort of a monopoly over the selling of the official souvenir products. However, now they are getting threatened by these cheaper unofficial souvenirs. These street traders are trying to, or basically have entered the market. So that is an example of how the market for official souvenir products at least is becoming more contestable. It was a nice MCQ, however. Which which assumption is made in calculating a firm's short run production function? Okay, so in the short run, all factors of production aren't, well, they're not, all of them aren't fixed. What basically happens is that at least one factor of production has to be fixed for you to operate in the short run. If all of them are variable, then you're in the long run. Your state of technology is fixed, because if your technology, if that increases or decreases, it shifts uh, the production function. If you recall what we used to hold constant while deriving or calculating our demand curve, we used to hold all factors that used to shift the demand curve constant. Because obviously you can't make a curve, you can't make a function if a factor comes about that completely shifts it altogether. So you hold whatever factors that shift such functions or curves constant, and obviously that kind of crosses out D because you can't make it variable. In the diagram, total cost is a firm's short-run total cost curve, so that's TC. Which statement is correct? Average total cost. Okay, so they're looking at average total cost, average variable cost, and marginal cost. So let's take a look here. How can we let's try to analyze the curve first before we go on to the options. Now we know that this particular amount, this is your fixed cost, because it does not vary. I mean, because that's the cost you're going to incur with zero output, right? Variable cost is only going to add as what do you call it, as output increases, which means your variable cost curve is somewhat um, what would be your variable cost curve? Would be somewhat like this, something like this, meaning that the vertical distance between the two curves is always going to be equals to your fixed cost. Okay, okay, so they've also talked to you about marginal cost. Now, marginal cost is a little difficult to come up with. Marginal cost would basically be your gradient here, because that gradient basically shows change in cost over change in output, which is basically what marginal cost is. So now we can try to figure out something and look at the options. A, average total cost, okay, is minimized at output of OQ2. So basically looking at the average total cost would be just total cost upon quantity. Now, if you think about it, I don't think it would be minimized at OQ2, because, well, then you have this much amount of total cost to be divided by this much output. But if you see at OQ3, then your total cost isn't going up by much. Your total cost is only going up by this much, but your output is increasing by a lot more, which means your numerator is increasing, but your denominator is increasing by a lot more, meaning it should be minimized. If anything, it should be minimized. It would be lower at least at OQ3 than OQ2. So with that logic, you can kind of cross out A. Average variable cost is minimized at OQ1. Now, well, kind of have to look at the same thing. If you think about it here, well, if where average variable cost would be minimized is the same point where average total cost will be minimized, because your fixed cost is going to be well, in fact, maybe not, because with total cost you have your fixed cost coming into play. But even if you look at your variable cost curve, this is well, excuse my penmanship, but this is generally an idea of what your variable cost curve will look like. So will this be minimized at OQ1? Probably not, because if you look at here, again, the same logic. This much cost for this much output. If you look at OQ2, the cost is increasing, but the output is increasing by more, which means it would probably be minimized at an output higher than OQ1. Average variable cost is minimized at OQ3. That is possible because, well, you have a pretty large output and not that much cost. So that is possible. It's a little difficult to tell because you don't have any numbers to look at here. Let's look at option D before we pick anything. Marginal cost is minimized at output OQ2. Well, in fact, that would be your correct option, because marginal cost is looking at basically your gradient. And if you look at the gradient for the curve that I've drawn for variable cost, or even if you look at the gradient of total cost, even that would give you the idea of marginal cost, because fixed cost won't really affect the gradient. Fixed cost will just shift the curve upwards from variable cost to total cost. The gradient here, if you want to draw a tangent and figure it out, it's very low. It's like the lowest gradient. It's the flattest side of the curve. If it's the flattest, it means the gradient is the lowest. Since marginal cost here was the gradient, marginal cost will be minimized there at OQ2. The table shows the total cost of a firm. What is the average variable cost of producing 4 units of output? So what is the fixed cost? Fixed cost is $40, because that is the cost that's incurred to you at 0 output. Now you have to look at the average variable cost of producing 4 units. So that would be AVC would be variable cost upon quantity. Now variable cost would not be 80, it would in fact be 40, because 80 minus the fixed cost, which is 40, also gives you 40. So 40 upon 4 would give you 10. 11. Which conditions must apply before a market can be regarded as perfectly contestable? Now here, perfect contestability only has one condition: 0 cost of entry to and exit from the industry, which is basically the same thing as saying no barriers to entry or exit. 12. The diagram shows the average and marginal revenue curves of an oligopolistic firm. Okay, so that's an oligopoly. OQ is the profit maximizing output. OQ, all right. Which curve could be the firm's marginal cost curve? Now you have to bear in mind that MR has to be equals to MC for profit maximizing. MC has to be equals to MR. Now it's clearly not A, because this gives you a different output. It's not B, because this would give you this output. It's not D, because this would give you this output. So it has to be C. And if you kind of think of this, here is where this is basically your gap, as the Americans call it, or your discontinuous regions, as the British call it. So the idea here is, if MC curves pass between this particular gap, if I can just clear this up a bit. So if you have MC curve here, MC curve here, MC curve here, it doesn't really matter. All of them would be regarded, all of them would give you the same output Q because they're passing between this, right? So if you are looking for this particular output, which you are, your MC curve has to pass through the discontinuous region. Kind of look at it like this. If that doesn't make sense, what you can think of is your MR curve coming like this, going like this, and then coming back like this. So clearly here, MC cuts MR at this point, giving you output Q. What is most likely to be found when comparing the long run equilibrium equilibrium outcome rather in monopolistic competition with that in perfect competition? Okay, so again we have to look at what is most likely. So a greater degree of excess capacity in monopolistic competition, yeah, pretty much. That is in fact the cost you pay for choice, because um, firms produce more, and because it's differentiated, they simply can't sell as much as they would be able to in perfect competition. So in fact this is very common. That the cost of achieving choice in monopolistic competition is the fact that there's a lot of wastage that goes about. There's a lot of if you do produce a lot more, or there's a lot of excess capacity in this particular case, and hence you can't really produce at your potential, because not all of it will sell, because there's a degree of differentiation, excuse the spelling, product differentiation that exists. A higher level of profit in monopolistic competition, that could be possible, but that doesn't necessarily have to happen, because if you look at your diagram, this is your AR, MR. Well, MR is supposed to start from here. MC, making you're producing at this particular point. Let's say if your average cost curve goes something like this, which is very possible, then it doesn't. Then you'd still be getting normal profits. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like true. It's not your most likely outcome. You'd have a larger number of firms in perfect competition, not monopolistic. You would have a more elastic demand curve in perfect, not monopolistic. So B and C were out from the get-go. So C and D were out from the get-go. Your choice was between A and B, and A just seems much more likely to happen, which is not a source of market failure. Imperfect information does result in market failure. Monopoly does result in market failure. So these two are out from the get-go. Income inequality. I don't think income inequality is categorized as market failure. I don't think income inequality is a reason that markets allocate inefficiently or don't allocate from society's perspective. Non-excludability kind of links to how public goods are non-excludable, and because public goods are non-excludable, the free rider problem exists. Private sector cannot charge a price for it, which is why they don't produce public goods, and hence market failure happens, which is why it would be B. The government wants to regulate the consumption of a demerit good, so a good that has significant negative externalities, which basically means that its social cost is going to be greater than its private cost, in order to increase society's net welfare. In which situation will the society's net welfare increase? The fall in the marginal social benefit is greater than the fall in marginal social cost. No, if MSB is less than MSC, I mean, if the fall is greater than of the benefit than it is with cost, how would that help? That would result in more cost than benefit. The fall in the marginal social cost is greater than the fall in the marginal social benefit. Yeah, because that would mean that your MSC is decreasing by greater amount than MSB is, which means overall MSB would start to move towards a point where it is either equals to or greater than MSC, which is fine, because if you look at demerit goods, the point of operation for demerit goods, at that point, marginal social cost exceeds marginal social benefit. So you want MSC to decrease by more so that these two can become equal. The fall in total, well, you never really look at totals to figure out where you want to allocate. So you can just cross out C and D without even paying that much attention to them. Let me quickly check my answers. Well, This is why one shouldn't be overconfident, because I got all of them right except for this one, except for 15. So let's look at this again. If you look here, something that I forgot, that's something that I didn't pay too much attention at before, was that I didn't look at. We're just not trying to go towards a socially optimum level. We're trying to increase the net social welfare. The net welfare is basically, how is social benefit minus social cost. If this is positive, well, obviously, then you do have some net welfare. But the idea here is you want to ensure that this becomes more positive in order for net social welfare to increase. In the current state, social cost is probably higher than social benefit. So because it's a demerit good, which means your net welfare is a negative. So you don't have net welfare, in fact. So in this particular case, because you want net welfare to increase, looking at A and B, well, we already had crossed out A, but looking at B wouldn't really be that appropriate, because you're talking about more, you're looking mainly as to where to allocate where rather than in which situation your net welfare will increase. Because if you think about this, if if MSC falls by greater than the fall in MSB, that um, that doesn't really give you an idea whether or not social benefit or social costs, uh, to what extent they are there. Because MSB, marginal social benefit and marginal social costs, only give you an idea as to how they're increasing. So now you might with B basically is telling you that MSC, that social cost is not increasing at the same rate as social benefit, but you don't know the absolute values of social costs or social benefit at which they started off. Maybe social cost is not increasing by the same rate, but it still overrides social benefit, meaning there is negative in welfare, meaning there isn't any welfare. So you can cross out B. I was looking too much as to where to allocate. If you're looking at where to allocate, then you look at MSC and MSB curves. But here we're just looking at in which situation, society's net welfare will increase. So the fall in total social benefit is greater than the fall in total social cost. No, because you want to ensure that this is basically as positive as possible. So you want to increase social benefit or you want to decrease social costs. Um, and so if social benefit falls by more than social cost, overall this will become negative, which is not what you want, giving you D, because the fall in total social cost is greater than the fall in total social benefit. So what D is saying social benefit is falling, but social cost is falling by more. Hence, this overall sum would become more positive, which means there is greater net welfare, societal welfare. Again, the reason why A and B were wrong, because they look at marginals, and while marginal will tell you the rate at which social benefit and social costs are changing, they won't really tell you what particular level social benefit and social costs are at, which is what we need to look at when we're figuring out net welfare, which is why it is D.